I used to believe love was quiet, that if I waited long enough, he'd notice me, that if I loved him purely, patiently, without asking for anything, he'd turn and realize it had always been me. And for a long time, I was content with that lie. Until the day my sister, Madison, slipped into his arms without hesitation, without shame. She knew I loved Ethan. She had watched me fall for him in silence. And when he started looking my way, just barely, she swept in like she always did, louder, flashier, bolder. The golden daughter, the one who always won. The betrayal wasn't just hers. It was his too, but hers cut deeper. I remember standing at the edge of the staircase, frozen, as I heard her giggle. It was so easy. That was the moment I died. The good, quiet girl they took for granted. She didn't survive that day, but someone stronger, colder, smarter was born in her place. I didn't confront her. I didn't cry or scream. That's what she expected. That's what they all expected. That I'd retreat humiliated and stay broken while they flaunted their new beginning. Madison always counted on my silence. She mistook it for weakness. What she didn't realize was that some silences are sharp. Mine wasn't surrender. It was the sound of steel hardening. I stopped waiting. I stopped hoping. I started planning. I said yes when my mother's friend arranged a meeting with Lucas Bennett, a man I barely remembered from school, who once asked Madison out and got laughed out of the room. He's so plain, she sneered. A total nobody. That was years ago. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Lucas had built an empire quietly, far from our shallow little social circle. And when I sat across from him in that quiet cafe, I didn't see a nobody. I saw a man who didn't need to be loud, to be powerful. Lucas didn't remember me at first. Not really, just a vague recollection of a girl who always had her head down. But I remembered him. The way he turned red when Madison mocked him. The quiet rage in his eyes. That kind of man doesn't forget humiliation. That kind of man builds in silence, waits for the right moment to strike. Over coffee, we spoke cautiously, two people used to being overlooked, used to being underestimated. He told me about his company, his investments, his plans to step into public business circles. I need someone who understands discretion, he said. Someone who knows how to play the game, not be played by it. I looked him in the eyes and said, "You don't want a woman who shines for the room. You want one who can control it without a word." For the first time, I saw something flicker behind his gaze. Recognition, respect, and then, slowly, interest. We didn't fall in love immediately. That wasn't the point. This wasn't a fairy tale. This was strategy. Two people who knew what it felt like to be discarded. Two people with wounds they didn't show the world. Lucas respected my silence, my pace. He didn't prod or ask for explanations. He simply said, "I don't need the whole story. I just need to know you're ready to write a new one." And I was, not for revenge alone, but for reinvention. I wasn't marrying him to make Ethan jealous. I wasn't marrying him to punish Madison. I was building something neither of them would ever be able to touch, something so far above their reach that when they finally looked up, they wouldn't recognize the girl they used to pity. Madison laughed when she found out we were engaged. "Lucas," she said, full of cruel delight, "you're really scraping the bottom, aren't you?" She didn't know he was now wealthier than Ethan's entire family combined. She didn't know he had influence in places she couldn't pronounce. She didn't know I'd already signed the prenup, one that secured my own shares in his company. And I smiled at her, calm, untouched. "Some men you marry for love," I said. "Others you marry to rewrite the entire narrative." She blinked, for the first time, unsure. And in that flicker of hesitation, I tasted the beginning of my revenge. It didn't need to be loud. It didn't need to be cruel. It just needed to be seen. The wedding was small, elegant, and private. No massive guest list. No social climbing crowd. Just power dressed in quiet linen and sharp diamonds. Madison wasn't invited. Neither was Ethan. But I made sure the photos found them. Me, radiant in custom silk. Lucas, unreadable beside me. We looked like royalty, the kind that didn't ask for approval, the kind that owned the room without raising their voices. And when the photos went public, featured in a high society magazine after Lucas's latest merger, Madison's silence was louder than any insult she had ever thrown my way. Ethan didn't say a word either, but I heard he stared at the article for hours. Lucas, and I didn't pretend to be in love. Not at first. Ours was a marriage of understanding, of aligned ambition. He respected my boundaries. I respected his power, but slowly, through quiet dinners, late-night strategy talks, and moments when he saw me not as a pawn but as a partner, something shifted. Not all love stories start with sparks. Some begin with mutual scars. He never asked me to be more than I was. And maybe that's why, for the first time, I started becoming more. Not for someone else, but because I finally felt safe enough to grow. I took my place beside Lucas, not as a trophy, but as a force. I learned fast, attended investor meetings, navigated networking events. People who once looked through me now shook my hand with careful reverence. I wasn't the plain sister anymore. I was Mrs. Bennet, the quiet strategist beside the empire builder. And I loved it, not because it made Madison jealous, but because it made me proud. For once, I was building something of my own. And every time I passed a mirror, I didn't see the girl they used to ignore. I saw the woman they could never manipulate again. One afternoon, I ran into Ethan at a gala. He looked thinner, tired, worn down in a way that success couldn't fix. "You look different," he said, voice cautious. "Happier." I smiled politely. "That's because I stopped loving people who only noticed me after they lost something else." His jaw clenched, and for a moment, I saw it, the regret. But it didn't move me. I didn't want him to hurt. I didn't want him at all. That was the most powerful shift of all. The girl who would have given everything for his love was gone. And in her place was a woman he could never reach again. After that night, Ethan became a shadow that flickered too often in the background. He started showing up at the same events Lucas and I attended, pretending it was coincidence. At first, I ignored him, let him stew in the discomfort he'd sown for himself. But one evening, as I stood by the balcony of a rooftop gala, he approached me with a drink in hand. "I never meant to hurt you," he said, eyes heavy with something like guilt. I turned to him slowly, met his gaze, and said, "But you did. And now that pain built something you'll never be part of." He stood there frozen, glass trembling. I didn't smile. I didn't flinch. I simply walked away and left him with nothing but the bitter taste of what could have been. He had chosen Flash. He had chosen Madison. Now he'd learn what it felt like to lose something far rarer. A woman who never needed to compete, just evolve. Madison wasn't handling the shift well. She stopped posting about Ethan. Her curated life began to crack. Word spread that their relationship had cooled. He was distracted, distant, preoccupied. With what? I already knew. I didn't lift a finger to speed their downfall. I didn't have to. People like Madison implode when they're no longer being envied. And now, when she walked into a room and saw me being greeted with warmth, with admiration, with respect, her expression faltered. I no longer envied her. I no longer wanted what she had, because now she wanted what I had, and could never create herself. Not loyalty, not partnership, not legacy, just image. And when image cracks, all that's left is insecurity. Lucas noticed the changes too. One night, over dinner, he looked at me and said, "You've stopped playing defense." I tilted my head. "What do you mean?" He smiled, rare and real. "You used to react. Now you create." He was right. I wasn't just rebuilding. I was building forward, unafraid. I wasn't measuring my worth in comparison to Madison or Ethan anymore. I was defining it by how I moved through rooms, how I handled my business, how I woke up without the need to look backward. That shift in energy changed everything. I was no longer the girl trying to prove herself. I was the woman who no longer had to. Lucas, and I began traveling for business. Paris, Dubai, Seoul. I watched him close deals with effortless confidence, and he watched me hold my own in circles that used to feel far above my reach. We were no longer playing roles. We had become something real, powerful, elegant, and dangerous in the best way. We moved like chess pieces in perfect sync. I wasn't afraid of being left behind. He wasn't afraid of being overshadowed. And that balance, that mutual respect, was something Madison never could have faked, no matter how polished her smile. Love was beginning to bloom, but it didn't look like fantasy. It looked like two survivors who finally stopped surviving and started living. My mother called me unexpectedly. "Your sister is struggling," she said. "Maybe you could talk to her?" The irony made me laugh. For years, I was the forgotten daughter, the one expected to tolerate and swallow pain in silence. Now that the favorite child had fallen from grace, I was suddenly useful again. "I hope she finds peace," I said, voice even, "but I'm not the one she needs." It wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. I didn't know Madison healing. I didn't know her comfort. What she did to me wasn't a mistake. It was a choice, and she made it without blinking. Lucas and I held a fundraiser for a cause we both supported: education for underfunded girls. It was the first event I fully led. Press, executives, cameras, and I handled it like someone who was born for it. I gave the keynote speech, and afterward, a well-known CEO approached me and said, "You should be in front of more rooms." That night, Lucas took my hand and whispered, "You're not beside me anymore. You're standing with me." And he was right. I was no longer the quiet girl in the corner. I was someone people noticed now, not because of scandal or drama, but because of impact. I saw Madison again. Briefly, we crossed paths at a charity brunch. Her makeup was flawless, her dress expensive, but her eyes? Hollow. She smiled, but it didn't reach her face. "You look different," she said. "Power suits you." I met her gaze without blinking. "It's not the suit," I replied. "It's the woman who wears it." I wasn't cruel. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The moment spoke for itself. She could still dress the part, but I was the part now. She had taken a man. I had taken back myself. And that, no matter how expensive her heels were, was something she could never wear. Ethan messaged me again. This time, a long, rambling apology about how he was confused, about how he thought Madison was the right choice, but realized too late that you were the calm in the storm. I read it once, then again, then deleted it without replying. I didn't hate him. I didn't wish him harm. I just didn't care. Closure doesn't always come with answers. Sometimes it comes from finally not needing them. I had built a life so high, so centered, that his voice no longer reached it. He had thrown away loyalty for excitement. Now, he was just a name I used to whisper in the dark. Long ago, before I woke up, Lucas saw the message. I didn't hide it. He read it, then handed me back the phone with a raised brow. "You want to talk about it?" he asked. I shook my head, not even a little. And that was the end of it. No jealousy, no accusations, just a quiet trust between two people who knew exactly what they had. It wasn't perfect, but it was solid. And sometimes solid is better than sparks. Sometimes it's the quiet, steady hand that steadies your soul. Madison and Ethan faded from relevance, and I, once forgotten, had become unforgettable. I wasn't chasing revenge anymore. That chapter had already closed itself perfectly, without screaming or spectacle. What I was chasing now was fulfillment, growth, legacy. And Lucas, he understood that instinct. We started laying the foundation for a foundation of our own, one that would sponsor young women starting over after betrayal, loss, or abandonment. Because sometimes the worst thing someone does to you, I said during our first planning meeting, is the best thing that could have ever happened. The team fell silent for a beat. Then they nodded. They knew. They didn't need to ask for the backstory. The woman standing at the head of the table was the story. My world expanded as my past shrank. I no longer recognized the girl who used to sit on the edge of her bed, waiting for someone to call, to choose her, to validate her. That girl was gone. In her place stood a woman who chose herself. Every single day, I made decisions without second-guessing. I invested without hesitation. I said no without guilt. And the beauty of that kind of growth is that no one can fake it, borrow it, or take it away. They have to earn their own version. I had earned mine with silence, dignity, and one hell of a rebirth. Lucas and I weren't a couple built on fairy dust or Instagram perfect moments. We were built from strategy, long nights, aligned vision, and a strange but comforting quietness. And slowly, the affection grew, rooted in trust, nurtured by respect. The way he looked at me across a room now made my chest ache, not from pain, but from knowing I had finally met a man who saw me clearly, not for how I could decorate his life, not for what I survived, but for who I had become despite it all. He didn't flinch at my power. He admired it. And when someone loves your rise instead of fearing it, that's when you know you're exactly where you're supposed to be. One evening, after an event where I spoke on a panel of female CEOs, we walked home through the city. Lucas slipped his hand into mine and said, "I used to wonder what it would feel like to build with someone. Now I know." I stopped walking, turned to him, and said, "And I used to wonder what it would feel like to be seen without shrinking." We didn't kiss. We didn't need to. That moment, mutual quiet, earned, was more intimate than any romantic cliché could touch. We weren't obsessed with each other. We were in sync. And there's nothing more powerful than two people moving forward without looking back. Madison's fall became public slowly, and I stayed out of it entirely. Ethan's company stumbled. Her influence waned. Rumors swirled about debt, infidelity, cold dinners behind glass walls. I didn't gloat. I didn't comment. I just focused on the next project, the next goal. Because real power doesn't have time for petty. I didn't build my life to rub it in anyone's face. I built it because they tried to bury me, and I wanted the roots to grow so deep they'd never find the bottom. That was the real satisfaction. Quiet, untouchable, permanent. I started getting interview requests from major media outlets. The reclusive wife of Lucas Bennett. The woman rewriting elegance in power. I accepted only a few. And when I spoke, I didn't tell them about Madison. I didn't name drop Ethan. I told them about resilience, about the kind of strength that doesn't come from being the loudest in the room, but from being the calmest. Power, I said once in a sit-down with a journalist, isn't loud. It's quiet and sure and earned, and it always walks in like it belongs. That line trended for a week, and I didn't even look at the comments. I didn't need applause to know it landed. Lucas and I took a break from the spotlight for a while, rented a villa in the hills of Tuscany where mornings were slow and the only decisions were red or white wine. There, under the wide-open sky, he turned to me one evening and asked, "If you could go back, would you change anything?" I thought for a long time. Then I said, "No, because without them, I wouldn't have found this. I wouldn't have found me." He smiled, kissed my hand, and replied, "That's the most dangerous kind of woman, the one who no longer needs to rewrite the past." We started talking about the future, not with urgency, but with excitement. A home near the water, maybe children, maybe not. A life of choosing, a life that didn't bend to expectation. "If we do have a daughter," I said one night, I want her to know she never has to be the loudest to be heard. Just the clearest, just the truest. Lucas raised his glass. Then she'll be just like her mother. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just nodded, because for once, I believed it. I believed I could raise someone who never had to recover from the wounds I was once handed. The foundation we built grew faster than expected. Donations poured in. Women from all over the country reached out. Survivors, dreamers, professionals, teenagers. They all wanted to know the same thing. How did you rise after being overlooked for so long? I didn't give them a formula. I gave them a mirror. You already have what you need. I told them. They just trained you not to see it. And as I stood on stage one evening, closing out our first national event, I said it loud and clear, "You're not too quiet. They were too noisy to notice your power. Let them go blind. Let them." Because by now, I was already blazing. I didn't realize how many people were watching until they started reaching out. Not for gossip, but for guidance. Women who had endured betrayal, competition, emotional starvation. They didn't want pity. They wanted a way out, a way through. And in me, they saw not a fairy tale, but proof. Proof that the quiet girl could rise, that the plain one could win, that the woman they ignored could become the woman they could never replicate. And every message, every tear-filled thank you whispered across a screen, reminded me why I did this. It was never about them. It was always about us. Lucas's parents, long distant and skeptical of me at first, came to visit one spring. His mother watched me across the table during dinner, her wine glass trembling slightly in her hand. "You've changed him," she said finally. "No," I replied, smiling. "He just finally has the freedom to be seen." She studied me for a long moment before nodding. "You're not what I expected." I met her gaze calmly. No one ever expects the woman who doesn't ask for permission to rise. But we do. And that night, something shifted. I wasn't just his wife. I was a woman who walked into every room like it was hers. I visited my childhood home alone one quiet afternoon. My mother greeted me with a mix of warmth and unease. Madison was away, or so she claimed. We sat in the kitchen, where I'd once cried over Ethan, where I'd once overheard Madison's cruel laughter, and drank tea. My mother said, softly, "You always had the strength. I just didn't know how to see it back then." I didn't reply. There was no apology that could fix that kind of blindness. But I nodded, because I wasn't there to punish her. I wasn't even there to be understood. I was there because I could walk into my past now without letting it burn me. Years ago, I would have begged for validation, for someone to say I mattered, to finally choose me. Now, their recognition didn't add a single ounce to my worth. Lucas once said, "The most powerful thing about you is that you know you don't need anyone's approval anymore." And it was true. Every decision I made was for me. Every boundary I enforced was mine alone. I didn't prove my worth to anyone. Not Madison, not Ethan, not society. I remembered it. And when you remember who you are, there's nothing they can take from you again. I opened a private mentorship circle, invitation only, not for popularity, for impact. 10 women at a time, each one carefully chosen, each one ready to stop being invisible. We didn't talk about getting revenge. We talked about getting up. One woman said, "I always thought power looked like control." I told her, "Real power looks like peace. If you have to scream to be heard, they weren't listening to begin with." We sat in that truth. And when she left, she didn't walk the same. Her shoulders weren't hunched. Her eyes didn't dart. She walked like a woman who had just remembered her fire. Lucas and I celebrated our 4th anniversary with no party, no photos, no posts, just a private dinner, a handwritten letter exchanged between us, and hours of soft conversation. I told him, "I never thought I'd have this kind of peace." He kissed the back of my hand. That's because they never intended for you to find it. He was right. Some people keep you in chaos, so you'll never rise. But once you leave the storm, you see clearly. And clarity, once tasted, is something you never settle below again. That night, I fell asleep knowing peace was no longer a dream. It was a habit. Madison, and I met one last time. Unplanned. A gala in New York. She looked tired, older than her years, still beautiful, but something hollow in her eyes had never refilled. She tried to fake confidence, but it cracked beneath her smile. "You won," she said, voice low. I tilted my head. It was never a competition. And that's what broke her, because for her, everything had always been a race. But I had left the track long ago. I wasn't running toward applause. I was walking in purpose. And the thing about walking in purpose, you don't need to beat anyone. You just become undeniable. Back in my hotel suite, Lucas handed me a glass of champagne. "Are you okay?" he asked. I nodded. "I don't hate her," I said. "I just no longer need anything from her." That was the difference. I hadn't risen to hurt anyone. I had risen so that I could finally breathe. My success wasn't vengeance. It was liberation. A soft, steady freedom that didn't look like headlines or drama, but like long mornings, deep rest, and knowing that not a single person in my life was there out of obligation. Everyone stayed because they saw the woman I had become and chose her. Sometimes I'd reread my old journals, the ones filled with heartbreak and silence and wishing. I didn't cry anymore. I didn't cringe. I felt proud, because that girl who once whispered, "Maybe I'm not enough," kept going. She kept believing. And every page after that was proof of how far she had come. I didn't erase her. I thanked her, because she carried me to this moment where I no longer bent for love, begged for attention, or waited to be chosen. I had chosen myself, and nothing in this world shined brighter than that. I didn't win because they lost. I won because I walked away and never once looked back. The day my story was featured in a national publication, I didn't tell anyone. Not Lucas, not even my assistant. I just bought a single copy, made tea, and sat by the window, reading it slowly. My photo was there, composed, confident, untouched by drama. The headline wasn't about betrayal or gossip. It read, "The Quiet Strategist Reshaping Power for Women Who Refuse to be Forgotten." I closed the magazine with a breath of quiet pride. That was the moment I knew I had shifted, not just from pain to peace, but from reaction to legacy. I wasn't part of the noise. I had become the blueprint for silence that wins. One of my ments messaged me that night. She'd just signed a lease to her first apartment after leaving a toxic relationship. She wrote, "I didn't think I could until I saw you did." I stared at her message for a long time. Then I responded with only one sentence. "Now, go become someone they never saw coming." Because that was the real mission now. Not just to heal, but to multiply that healing. To make sure no woman stayed stuck, simply because no one had shown her the way forward yet. Lucas and I invested in a scholarship fund for young women in law, business, and political leadership. "We don't need more girls who shrink," I said at the board meeting. "We need girls who sit down and own the table." The room was silent. Then applause broke out. And that's when it hit me. I wasn't the story anymore. I was the one writing them, setting fires others would warm themselves by. That was the real win. Not attention, not admiration, but impact. And once you taste impact, attention starts to feel like crumbs. I had no appetite for crumbs anymore. My days were full, not busy, peaceful, not passive. I chose work that lit me up, people who built me up, and love that never once asked me to play small. Lucas never held me back, never dimmed my light to shine brighter. In fact, the brighter I burned, the more his eyes softened with pride. We weren't perfect, but we were real. And that reality, built on choice not desperation, felt better than any fantasy I used to beg for. It was a life I could breathe in every single day without choking on the memory of who I used to be. I no longer reacted when someone mentioned Madison or Ethan. Their names held no weight in my lungs. No spike of heat, just air. There's a peace that comes when you outgrow even the anger. When the things that used to make you shake now barely flicker in your mind. That's the part no one tells you about healing. It doesn't roar. It whispers. It becomes your new normal so quietly that one day you realize you haven't thought about them in months, that their faces are blurry, that your life is so full now, their absence doesn't feel like a gap, but a gift. One morning, Lucas surprised me with a quiet getaway to a coastal cottage. No phones, no work, just the sea and stillness. There, we spent hours talking about everything and nothing. I told him things I'd never said aloud, about the girl I used to be, the pain, the silence, the loneliness of waiting to be loved. He listened, truly listened, and then he said something I'll never forget. You're not just the woman who rose. You're the woman who stayed risen. And he was right. Rising once is brave, but staying there, staying unshaken, even when the past tries to whisper again, that's power. I wrote one last letter to my old self, not to mourn her, but to free her. I wrote, you did everything right with the tools you had. You weren't weak. You were surviving the only way you knew how. But now, we know better. We choose better. And because of you, I got here. I folded the letter and tucked it into a journal I no longer used. A symbol, a closing, a thank you. Not all pain needs to be burned. Some of it deserves to be buried gently, with grace. When I gave a keynote speech to a room full of world leaders, I didn't think about Madison, or Ethan, or anyone who once overlooked me. I thought of the 10,000 women watching quietly from the corners of their lives, wondering if it was too late for them. And into the mic, I said, the most dangerous version of a woman is the one who remembers her worth without needing it echoed back to her. The room went still, because it wasn't just a line. It was the truth I had bled for. After that speech, an elderly woman hugged me backstage with tears in her eyes. I stayed too long, she whispered. I held her hand. But you're still here. That means you still get to leave differently. Her shoulders shook as she cried, and I held her like I would have held myself years ago, if I could go back. Because this story, my story, was never just mine. It was every woman who waited, who hurt, who rebuilt, and who, one day, stood up without needing to scream. The best revenge is not success. It's peace that doesn't need proof. I didn't send Madison a letter. I didn't write Ethan a final message. That kind of closure no longer lived in me. I had nothing left to prove to people who misjudged my quiet for emptiness. And more than that, I had no interest in reopening doors that were locked for good reason. Some goodbyes don't come with drama. Some come silently when you simply outgrow the entire room. That's what they became. Furniture in a house I no longer lived in. My life had moved to a whole different address, one they couldn't even find. Lucas and I celebrated our 5th anniversary with a quiet dinner and a new plan to mentor couples who wanted more than romance, who wanted real partnership. We should teach what we know, he said. I smiled. We should teach what we learned the hard way. Because surviving betrayal doesn't just give you a story, it gives you a blueprint. And sometimes the best thing you can do with pain is turn it into protection for someone else still learning to leave. We started offering retreats for women building businesses after divorce, abandonment, or betrayal. We taught strategy, but also taught self-worth. And as I watched them pitch ideas, negotiate terms, raise capital with trembling voices, and steel in their spines, I saw versions of myself everywhere. I didn't tell them how to heal. I simply showed them what healed looked like. And that gave them permission to stop waiting for permission. Power, I told them, isn't loud. It's consistent. It's choice, over and over, to rise when you're expected to disappear. I walked into a bookstore one rainy afternoon and found my own book on the Empowered Women shelf. I didn't cry. I didn't smile wide. I just ran my fingers over the spine and whispered, "We made it. Not just me, but the version of me who once sobbed on the cold kitchen floor, thinking no one would ever choose her. She didn't die in that darkness. She handed me the torch, and I carried it all the way here. We traveled less, stayed home more, spent our evenings in gardens instead of airports. Life didn't shrink, it deepened. Love didn't cool, it warmed. And in the calm, I found something even rarer than happiness. Contentment. I didn't need more. I just needed peace. And peace came, not with the absence of problems, but with the clarity that I would never again abandon myself for someone else's comfort. I was home. In myself. In him. In the life we built from ashes. One afternoon, I received a letter with no return address. Madison's handwriting. Inside just one line. "I didn't understand what I was doing to you back then." I didn't respond. Not out of cruelty. Out of peace. Because forgiveness had already happened, quietly within me, and I didn't need her to say it. I had forgiven her the day. I no longer felt the need to explain anything. The past didn't deserve my voice anymore. My voice belonged to the future. Years later, I gave a talk titled "The Power of the Quiet Woman." I stood before thousands, but in my mind, I was speaking to one version of myself, the girl no one noticed, the girl who whispered instead of shouted. I told them, she doesn't need to become louder. She just needs to remember she was always enough. The applause wasn't thunderous. It was steady, just like me. And that felt right. I didn't need to shake the earth. I just needed to walk across it like I own my space. That was the lesson. That was the legacy. Lucas and I adopted a daughter, not because we needed to complete something, but because we had more love than we knew what to do with. And the first time she called me Mom, I realized this was the real win. Not the business, not the recognition, but becoming the kind of woman I would want my daughter to look up to. A woman who rose without burning everything behind her. A woman who grew power without losing softness. A woman who once lost herself and came back stronger. We don't tell our daughter fairy tales. We tell her stories of brave women, quiet heroes, and strength that doesn't always roar. I tell her about the time I almost forgot who I was and how I remembered. I tell her that love should never ask you to shrink, that silence can be strength, and that the life worth building is the one where you never apologize for your light. She listens with wide eyes, and I hope with every breath she never needs to learn it the hard way. I didn't just rise. I stayed risen. I didn't just survive. I changed the shape of every room I walked into. And I didn't just move on. I became someone unforgettable, even to myself.